The gym was filled with a slight smell of sweat and disinfection, and Laura was standing in front of the mirror, looking at herself with unusual rigor, trying to remember the last time she felt this determined. And here she was, in her sweatpants and her bright shirt, with her tail tied in her car, and she was not the same person she had been for a long time. 34 years old, a housewife raising a teenage son, married to a successful but overly busy lawyer, and the classroom was her first decision in a long time. Unrelated to her son, to her house, to her obligations to Ted, and her husband seemed to have lost interest in her long ago, but Laura tried not to think about it. She was used to everything, especially the evenings they spent together in the same house, but as if on different planets. Laura quickly looked at her watch. In a minute her new coach, Mark, was due. Until recently, the very idea of a personal trainer seemed strange to her, but the administrator was so confident that he would be perfect for her that Laura finally agreed. "Laura? Hello." A ringing, confident voice came out. She turned around and saw Mark. Tall, athletic, with a short red beard and a perfectly fitted t-shirt, he immediately stood out among the audience. His smile was friendly and kind of enveloping, as if he knew he could easily make friends with her. "Yes, that's me." Laura smiled, feeling a little awkward. "Great. I'm Mark, your coach. Let's get you on the floor, okay? That'll be easier, especially when I'm making you jump and sit down." He laughed, and his laugh turned out to be contagious. Laura nodded, smiling in response. It seemed like he wasn't just keeping a record of her stats. He was really interested in her, wanted to know what brought her here. "So, what do you want from this class? What's your main motivation?" he asked, putting his hands on her chest. Laura thought. Mark nodded as if her words meant something to him. "Got it. That means we're not just going to train. We're going to look for confidence, right?" "You're right." His touch was confident and professional. But Laura suddenly felt some unexpected warmth. Not what she would have felt from her husband's touch if it had happened. And Mark took her to the gym, and she couldn't help but notice that he kept his eye on her, cheering her up with a smile, correcting her technique, and noting her progress every time. It seemed like every little thing she did was genuinely enjoyable. "Are you sure you haven't done it before?" "Great form," he said when she did the press exercise. "Thank you. I haven't really done anything like this in a long time," Laura replied, feeling the pleasant warmth of his compliment. For the first time in a long time, she had someone supporting and praising her. Ted was different. He took it for granted as part of his daily life, and their relationship had long since lost the warmth and lightness that it had once had, and Laura used to think that this was the case in all marriages, that there was a certain level of time when fire becomes a habit. But Mark made her think, is that supposed to be? After an hour of practice, she was already feeling pretty tired. At the end of the class, they sat down on the bench outside the hall, and Mark handed her a bottle of water. "Good. You were in a rush today," he said, smiling. "Yeah, I haven't felt that way in a long time." "Thank you, Mark." He nodded again, but he didn't look away. This look was confident and calm, but it had some depth. It was as if he saw her, all her desires, her problems, and her doubts. "Are you going home to your family?" he asked, as if in the middle of something. "Yes," Laura answered with a slight confusion. She had a note of disappointment in her voice, but she tried to hide it with another smile. "Well, if you ever need to talk besides the workout, I'm here. You know, sometimes the conversation is as important as the physical training." She thanked him and went out, feeling a lightness that she hadn't felt in a long time. It seemed like she was surrounded by a new energy, fresh and inexplicable. She was barely in the car when her phone rang. A message from Ted saying, "I'm late, don't wait for dinner." She read it, but surprisingly, she didn't feel any anger or resentment. Laura looked at the screen of her phone, then at the gym door where Mark was standing, and she smiled at her thoughts. And for the first time in a long time, something appeared that she had been looking forward to. And it wasn't a dinner for two or a movie, but a training session. Her own little private time where she could just be herself. "Should I worry about this?" she asked herself, closing the car and looking in the mirror. Too many questions, too few answers, and only one thing was clear. She was alive again. Laura would come to the gym every time with a slight trembling, not only for the physical activity, but also for the meeting with Mark. Her morning was filled with busy caring for her son, housework, endless phone calls. For the last few months, she had been on autopilot, but she had to tie her shoes and walk across the threshold, and everything changed. It was here, under Mark's clear but attentive guidance, that Laura became different. Mark was like reading her mind and mood. When she came in tired, he would adjust the workout to her strength, and when she saw his smile, she would forget about her worries. In class, they talked a lot, and gradually she would tell him things she hadn't told anyone. And what do you do the rest of the time? On nothing interesting. Housework, cooking, taking care of the son, shopping, and of course the support of the husband, she added with a slight smile, but she felt a sting somewhere inside. Mark grinned and looked at her and said, "Well, it's work too. You're strong enough to handle any load." Laura was confused by his words. She tried not to go into too many details, but Mark was a good listener. He could easily notice her mood, even the slightest changes, as if he was studying her, try to understand what was behind her usual smiles and silences. Unlike Ted, who was used to the results but didn't notice the process, over time Laura began to notice that her gym sessions became more than just exercise, and the memories of the workouts were with her all day, as if it was the important time she needed to be herself. And it wasn't so much about the sport, but about Mark, his way of speaking, of supporting, even of listening. And he seemed to understand her in a way that Ted hadn't understood her for a long time. And one day, when Laura came to the gym in a particularly bad mood, Mark noticed it. She had just walked out of the gym, and he came up to her and said, "Are you okay? You're not yourself today." Laura was stunned. She didn't want to share her problems with him, but the question was so sincere. She felt she couldn't hide the truth. "It's like my life is a set of roles that I play for everyone but myself." He listened quietly, without interrupting. That silence was incredibly comfortable. "And I'm glad I could be the person who gives you that attention," he added with a warm but slightly shy smile. And those words made a big impression on her. Laura was surprised at how much this simple, sincere confession had touched her. For the first time in a long time, she felt that someone didn't care. She felt a strange warmth, a pulsating feeling, something she hadn't felt in a long time. And after that conversation, their meeting took on a new tone, and she noticed that Mark sometimes kept looking at her a little longer than was polite, and she caught herself thinking about him more and more. Sometimes when he got too close to her, she started to feel her breath, as if for the first time in her life. One night, Laura was sitting at home alone while Ted was at work, and she took out her phone and opened the messenger, thinking about writing Mark, and he offered to talk to her if she wanted to. And now she found it particularly appealing. But texting meant admitting that their communication was no longer just working, and she was afraid to admit it. At that moment, her son Jake came into the kitchen and interrupted her thoughts. "Mom, do you know what a personal trainer is?" he asked, looking at her with a slight smile. She was surprised. "Yes, of course. Why are you asking?" Laura felt a slight chill. This conversation they never discussed with Ted. Deep down she knew that her work with Mark had become more than just sports for her. And now she had to explain it not only to herself but to Ted. "And you look different." And Jake laughed, but Laura was surprised. So, the training was working, and she joked, trying to hide her embarrassment. Laura couldn't sleep for a long time after that conversation, and she realized that her encounter with Mark had affected not only her, but her family. She had a question in her head that she couldn't answer. What did she really feel about Mark? The next day, they met again in the hall, and Laura couldn't relax. She was overly stressed and didn't recognize herself. At one point, while she was doing another exercise, Mark came too close to her, and she smelled it, a light, almost imperceptible scent, but enough to make her heart beat faster. "Hey, are you all right?" It was like a shock, and Laura nodded and turned to focus on her breathing. "Yes, it's okay," she said, but her voice was trembling. Mark was silent, as if thinking about something, and then said quietly, "If something's wrong, you know you can trust me." Laura couldn't answer because the words were stuck in her throat. She was just nodding. But inside, everything was turning around, and she was struggling, and she didn't know how to deal with this new, unfamiliar feeling, and the training was over, but Laura felt like something important was being decided. She was standing in a locker room when Mark came up to her and said, "You know, sometimes we do something new not for a change in the body, but for a change in a life." And his words have penetrated her soul, and she's been shaking, and she's realized that every time she comes here, she's not just looking for a physical renewal, but a chance to be seen, understood, and heard, something that hadn't been in her life for a long time. With each new workout, Laura became more and more aware that her feelings for Mark could no longer be called friendly or casual. She felt that their communication went beyond the training. This frightening, but at the same time attractive feeling made her wait for the class with increasing dread and excitement. A thought began to form in her mind, which she struggled to get rid of. These exercises had become more important and more expensive than she could afford, and each session was a light and friendly atmosphere, but she felt that there was something between them that could not be expressed in words. And there were casual glances that lasted a little longer than they should have, and touches that were not just professional, but also somehow warm, like warming her soul. One day, after a particularly intense workout, Mark offered her a cup of coffee. "I know a great place nearby. The coffee there is a bomb." Laura paused for a moment, not knowing what to say. On the one hand, it was a harmless offer. Coffee. A few words over a cup of coffee. Nothing more. But the inner voice that was warning her seemed to literally scream that it was too risky. She was afraid that if she agreed, her feelings might go beyond the normal range of friendly communication, but she was attracted to him like a magnet, and she couldn't refuse. "Well, why not?" she replied, trying to pretend that this simple decision didn't cost her all the inner struggle. Mark took her to a small cozy cafe around the corner. It was quiet and cozy inside, smelling of fresh baked goods and coffee, and the soft light created a warm, homey atmosphere. They sat at the window table, and Laura caught her reflection in the glass, a strange mixture of excitement and pleasure in her eyes. She looked at Mark, who was just ordering, and wondered what she was doing here, and the conversation started to get simple. Exercise, books, music. But then Mark asked her the unexpected question. "Laura, are you happy?" "What's the matter?" he asked quietly, leaning towards her in a way that made his face look closer than she expected. The question caught her by surprise, but she felt as if someone had touched her most vulnerable spot. It was something she had been afraid to ask herself for a long time. She knew that Mark had noticed her confusion, but he didn't rush to answer, just looked at her carefully, without looking away. His eyes were not condemnation, but genuine interest. "I don't know, Mark," she finally breathed out. "I used to be happy. But with time everything changed. Too much routine, too many obligations. Sometimes I feel like I stopped feeling, stopped being myself." Mark listened to her quietly. His eyes were soft, understanding. Laura suddenly felt like a heavy burden had been lifted from her. She realized that she had never spoken about it so openly, not even to herself, not to anyone else. "I understand," he answered calmly. "I think a lot of people go through this. Sometimes it's enough to look at yourself from the other side to see what you really want." She was drawn to him even more. Mark was the only one who could understand her without words, without judgment. And he was not just a coach, but a man who saw in her more than just a wife and a mother, and she felt free with him. And that night, Laura couldn't sleep, and she was twisting around, her thoughts going back to their conversation. That quiet evening in the cafe, where they could be just themselves, without masks or commitments, became for her a sort of forbidden, exciting dream from which she didn't want to wake up. She knew she was too attached to him, and at the same time, She was afraid what would happen if Ted found out. The next day, Laura woke up with a heavy feeling. She felt guilty about Ted, even though she hadn't done anything wrong. It was all in her head, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had crossed an invisible line. Meeting Ted at breakfast only increased her inner doubts. Ted looked tired and distracted, his thoughts clearly far away. He was sitting across from her with a cup of coffee, immersed in his thoughts. "Ted," she started, deciding to try to talk anyway, "Are you happy with the way we live?" He looked up a little surprised and obviously didn't expect to ask. "Laura, why did you ask that? You seem happy, didn't you?" She felt something inside her tighten up. He didn't notice her doubts. He didn't hear her. He didn't understand her. Her husband seemed to be living in some sort of world of his own, where she didn't belong, where he didn't ask questions, where he didn't look for answers. And it was this silence between them, which Ted took as the norm, that became for Laura the symbol of all that she had lost. She couldn't talk about it with anyone. Only Mark was the one she could be with. But she was afraid that her feelings for him, her thoughts about him, were starting to overshadow everything else. At the next practice, Mark asked her a question again that took her breath away. "How can I explain to him that every time she comes here, she seems to find herself again? That his attention and support have been her salvation? I think I just wanted to feel alive," she said at last, barely holding back her tears. Mark nodded, but his eyes were still warm and understanding, and he took a step forward, and his hand briefly touched her shoulder, as if he didn't know it, but Laura felt her heart beating in her chest, and she could barely resist holding his hand in return. It was a simple and innocent gesture, but at the same time, they both knew it meant so much more, and at that moment, Laura felt that the line she was afraid of crossing was behind her, and she knew that this feeling would not go away, and neither would her feelings for Mark. There was a painful choice ahead of her, from which she had been trying to escape all this time, and she took a slow breath, looking around, as if she was afraid that someone might see them, hear them, understand them, and she had a decision in her heart that she hadn't yet realized. Perhaps she's faced with a choice between the past and the present, between what she thought was a duty and what she began to think was happiness. Laura stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long time, looking at her reflection. Her gaze lingered on her own eyes, which were lit by a mixture of anxiety and expectation. Today she will see Mark again. She had this strange feeling inside her that she was going to meet someone with whom she had more in common than just a training session, and she knew it had gone too far, but she couldn't stop, and the days she didn't see him seemed empty gray. With Mark, her life was filled with warmth, with feelings that she had almost forgotten what it was like to hope and wait. In the hall, she met him as usual, trying to hide her growing excitement. Mark smiled at her, and Laura felt the familiar calm instantly dissolve. They began training as usual, but there was a tension between them, unbearable and heavy. She tried to concentrate, but every time he got closer, her heart started beating faster. She didn't have to ask questions. Everything she felt was clear. After the practice, they stopped at the exit, and Mark, looking at her carefully, suggested. She was walking along the street, where the first autumn leaves were falling from the trees on the sidewalk, and the gentle breeze was shaking them, creating a sense of comfort and silence. Mark didn't say anything, but his presence was soothing and alarming to Laura. They stopped at a small park where there was an old wooden bench and sat next to each other, not knowing what to say. Finally, Mark turned to her and said quietly, "Laura, what's going on between us? I can't ignore it." She felt as if she had stopped breathing. All the thoughts she was afraid to say, even to herself, were now echoing in his voice. She tried to find the right words, but felt that they were all insufficient. "I don't know, Mark," she replied, looking at her hands, "but I know that what I feel next to you is more than just friendship." He was silent, giving her the opportunity to speak. Laura felt that if she didn't tell me everything she was feeling, she might lose something important. "I've been living like a dream, my marriage, my life, It's all become a routine, and I've long ceased to feel happy. I felt alive again. Mark put his hand on her palm, and she wouldn't take it away. She felt the warmth of his touch, and something inside her was torn apart. And I don't want you to sacrifice yourself for something that destroys you. His words hit her harder than she expected. He was right. She had lived a life long enough that there was no room for her own desires. But could she afford to give up everything? Laura looked away, feeling anxiety inside. She knew she was on the verge of making a choice that would affect her future. The next day, when she got home, she was barely able to close the door when Ted appeared in the hallway, his face tense, serious. She knew immediately that he knew something. "Ted, you know I go to class there." "Yeah, but your classes have been getting too frequent lately. I'm starting to think you found something more than just training there," he said so coldly that she was cold inside. His suspicions were like a cold shower. He came closer, looking straight into her eyes. She felt her soul tearing apart from fear and guilt, and Laura knew she couldn't deny what was going on inside her. But could she confess? Deep down she knew that if she told the truth, she would lose everything she and Ted had built over the years. "Ted," she whispered, "it's not what you think." His face was distorted in a strange mixture of relief and pain. "Laura, I know we've grown apart," he said, lowering his voice. "But if you want to end our marriage, tell me. I deserve to know the truth." Her heart was breaking with controversy. She looked at him, and there was something resentful in his eyes. She hadn't seen him so vulnerable in a long time. "We live as neighbors, as strangers." Those words seemed to reflect everything she'd been trying to hide from herself for so long. She felt her body relax, like a weight she'd been carrying for years was finally lifted off her shoulders. Ted shook as if her words had hit him. "So it's true? Did you find someone else?" "What's the matter?" he asked, his voice full of pain and resentment. Laura didn't answer, but her silence was eloquent enough. Ted knew she couldn't pretend anymore. Deep down, he probably already knew that what they once called love had long since passed. But to realize it out loud was much harder. Later that evening, Laura went outside to be alone. She sat on the bench and looked up at the stars as if to answer her questions. Her phone rang a message from Mark. "Laura, are you okay? Let's meet tomorrow and talk. I'll wait for you at the cafe, as usual." She felt her heart beat. She knew she had to meet him. But what happened next? Could she afford to give up everything she had for the sake of ghostly happiness? The next day, she came to the cafe where they had been that night. Mark was already waiting for her. When she came in, he immediately knew from her face that something important had happened. We lost each other." Mark listened to her in silence, and his eyes were full of compassion and understanding. "Laura, I can't tell you what to do. I know only one thing. You deserve love and happiness. And if it's not with Ted, then maybe with someone who will truly appreciate you." She felt something trembling inside her. She realized that she had to make a choice that would affect her future, and they sat next to each other, silently looking at each other, and there was no more unspoken silence between them. And she felt that this was going to be a turning point in her life. She knew that her life was about to change forever, and that no matter what happened, she would never be the same. Ted was sitting in his office, staring at the blank computer screen and thinking. He was distracted by the last conversation he had with Laura. He had started to notice her alienation long ago, but he hoped it was temporary. His work and his routine took up all his time, but now he suddenly realized that after all these years of working and succeeding in the legal profession, he had lost it. And now that the truth had finally come out, he felt a wave of anger and resentment rise in his chest. That day, he arrived at the gym without warning, to finally see for himself who his wife had been spending so much time with. He got there a little bit early, saw her car in the parking lot. He didn't think twice. He went inside, and he went up to the second floor where the training was, and he found the door to one of the halls open, and he saw Laura and Mark, and they were doing a stretch in front of the mirror. And she was laughing. She was laughing so honestly and freely that he hadn't seen her laugh in years. It was a laugh of a woman, not overwhelmed by worries, not overwhelmed by responsibilities, but joyful and carefree. And it was a sight that cut him. Everything he had inside had to come out. Laura saw him almost immediately when she felt the look. She froze, her smile instantly disappeared. Mark, noticing her reaction, also turned around. There was a crushing silence. Ted approached them, his hands in his pockets, but his gaze was deeply hurt. "Laura, can I have a word with you?" Laura nodded, feeling her whole body freezing in horror. And she turned to Mark, who was waiting for her to say something, but Laura just nodded and went to the exit where Ted was waiting for her. They went outside and went to Ted's car. Ted got behind the wheel, took a deep breath, and then turned to her. "You were happy there," he said, as if to state a fact. "Much happier than I've been in years." Laura, with her strength, looked back. She had nothing to say. Ted finally said what he should have said years ago. "I always thought that as long as I was providing for my family, working, looking after the future, that was enough. That if we didn't fight, we were fine. But I guess I missed the most important part." Laura closed her eyes, feeling her longing and pain for what they had. "I went back to the routine myself," she said quietly. "We just stopped noticing each other." He nodded, but the hurt and bitterness didn't leave his face. "And now I know you've found someone who noticed you," he replied, looking away. "Well, maybe it's even better for both of us." Those words sounded bitter and empty, and Laura realized that these conversations could only free them. She was growing liberated and confused. Her marriage, everything she had built with Ted, was falling apart. But the breakup was inevitable, and when Laura came home, she was empty, and her thoughts of Ted were intertwined with her thoughts of Mark, and she couldn't separate the guilt from the growing sense of freedom, and she realized that her life was finally coming out of the shadow of compromise and indecision. But what happens next? How do they live with this new feeling? Can they and Ted keep any connection for their son? Try to calm down? She sits down on the couch, thinking. She realizes that her life is now divided into before and after. Everything she's been hiding inside has now been exposed, and she's facing the consequences. Suddenly, her phone rings. "It's Mark." She picked up the phone, not knowing what to say. His voice sounded a little restless. "Laura, are you okay? What happened after you left?" She closed her eyes, feeling something inside her tremble from his voice again. "And we probably won't be able to be together like we used to be." And there was a pause at the other end of the wire, and finally Mark said, "If you need any help or just talk, I'm always here," and his voice was soft, and she felt that the offer was sincere. She knew that their relationship with Mark might be challenging, but she felt free with him, and she knew that everything was up to her now, and that whatever she chose would be her decision. And as she said goodbye to Mark, she felt a new sense of freedom and self-confidence begin to build within her. She was ready to accept her mistakes, make her decisions, and face the future, whatever it was, and she was looking out the window as the evening lights lit up the deserted streets, and she was thinking about Ted saying, "Now I know you found someone who's noticed you." This phrase, full of bitterness and fatigue, seemed to reflect everything that had happened between them over the years. The next day, she decided to meet Mark. She realized that now that her marriage was coming to an end, she had to figure out what she really wanted. Their meetings with Mark were filled with passion and a sense of novelty. But was she willing to give it all up for it? Laura took her coat and went to their usual cafe, where Mark was already waiting for her. "You look a little different," he said as she sat across the table. She smiled, realizing he was right. Something really changed. After a frank conversation with Ted, Laura felt like she was relieved. The pain was still there, but for the first time in a long time, she felt free from the uncertainty and the closed circle that her family life had become. Mark took her hand and, looking straight into her eyes, quietly asked, "Have you made a decision?" Laura was silent for a moment, trying to see if she was ready to hear her own answer. I don't know what's going to happen next. Ted and I can't be together anymore. It's true, she said, feeling her voice trembling more and more with every word she said. But I'm afraid, Mark, that if I break it now, I'll lose my family. I'll lose what's been a part of me for so many years. Mark listened attentively. His eyes were filled with care and understanding. But I can be there for you no matter what you decide. If you want to take a break, if you need time, I'll understand. Just know that I'll always be there. His words sounded sincere, but they felt something more. He was the one who gave her the strength to decide, to let her make her own choices. Thank you, Mark, she answered quietly, feeling her eyes rolling with tears. I've lived for a long time, afraid to be myself, afraid to not live up to expectations. With you, I felt for the first time that I could be real. He just squeezed her hand tighter, without saying a word. This gesture was enough to give Laura the warmth and support she hadn't felt in a long time. After their meeting, Laura decided to spend some time alone to finally understand her feelings. She went to the ocean, the place that always gave her peace, and sat on the shore, looking at the waves and contemplating her future. She was scared that the life she had so carefully built was now collapsing, but at the same time she was feeling liberated, feeling that she could start over. And her phone rang, and it was a message from Ted. I respect your decision. Let's do this civilized for Jake. She knew that their divorce was inevitable, and that it was the best decision for both of them. And she remembered Mark's words, his willingness to support her in any choice. And for the first time in a long time, she felt confident that she was now owned by someone else, and that awareness was both frightening and inspiring. Laura moved to a small apartment near Jake's school, and she felt she had finally found her own space and time for herself. Her life with Ted was in the past, but they maintained a warm, friendly relationship for the sake of their son. Laura realized that this experience was not a breakdown for her, but a new beginning. Mark continued to be a part of her life, but now their relationship had moved to a new level. Calm, thoughtful, without the passion and haste of the past. They both realized that something more than just romance had arisen between them. It was a partnership in which each gave the other the right to be themselves. Laura and Mark enjoyed walking together, talking for hours in quiet evenings without any extra commitments. One evening, sitting with Mark on a park bench, Laura looked at his profile and realized that her life had finally found meaning. She was no longer afraid to be herself, to make decisions that others might not like. She realized that her happiness depended on her alone and that she now had every chance to live the way she wanted. Mark turned to her and, meeting her gaze, quietly asked, "Are you happy?" Laura smiled, feeling her heart fill with warmth. "Yes," she answered, looking into his eyes. They were sitting there, quietly enjoying the moment, and Laura realized that she had finally found what she was looking for: inner peace and harmony. All she needed to do was learn to be honest with herself, and now that that path had been taken, she was ready for a new, real life.